Deep in the untamed wilderness, Daniel, a seasoned conservationist, hears a chilling cry pierce through the trees. A massive black bear, ensnared in a ruthless steel trap, thrashes in agony, its blood and tears staining the earth. Staring into its wild, terrified eyes, Daniel faces a heart-pounding choice: walk away or risk his life for the beast. One daring move changes everything, plunging him into a mystery no one could predict. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. Thank you. Daniel had been in the wilderness for years, long enough to feel a deep, unspoken connection to the land, the trees, and the creatures that roamed it. The cool breeze rustled the leaves above him, and the distant sound of a rushing stream echoed through the forest. As a seasoned outdoorsman and wildlife conservationist, Daniel knew the forest like the back of his hand. He could identify every bird call, recognize the tracks of different animals, and read the weather with an uncanny accuracy. Yet nothing in his extensive experience had ever prepared him for what he would encounter on this routine expedition. The morning had begun like any other. Daniel had woken early, packed his gear, and set off into the woods for his usual patrol. He wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just a few more signs of the changes in animal behavior as winter approached. But as he walked deeper into the forest, something unusual caught his eye. It was a sound, faint but distinct, carried on the wind, a low, guttural sobbing. At first, Daniel thought it might be the wind itself, but the closer he got, the clearer it became that the sound was alive, and it was in distress. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced as he scanned the area, the sobs growing louder with each step. He quickly followed the sound, his trained senses guiding him toward the source. When he rounded a bend in the path, he saw it, an adult black bear, its massive body struggling to free itself from a cruel steel trap, its movements frantic and desperate. The trap had clamped down on its front paw, and the bear's tears mixed with the dirt and blood beneath it. For a moment, Daniel froze, his hand instinctively gripping the knife at his side. The bear's eyes, wide with pain and fear, locked onto his. They were pleading. It wasn't just a wild animal caught in a trap. It was a creature suffering, a living being in desperate need of help. But Daniel knew the risks. A bear in such agony could lash out in an instant. The force behind that animal's fear and pain could be deadly. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps as he assessed the situation. The bear was enormous, far larger than anything he'd faced before in the wild. His mind weighed the possibilities. He could walk away, leave the bear to its fate, and report the trap to the authorities. But something about the helplessness in those eyes struck him deep. He had spent his life protecting wildlife, advocating for them, and this felt like an opportunity to do something real. His chest tightened as he considered the danger. He had handled difficult situations before: injured animals, unpredictable storms, even dangerous predators. But this was different. This wasn't a calm rescue. This was a bear in excruciating pain, its instincts telling it to fight. And Daniel knew that if the bear felt threatened in its vulnerable state, it wouldn't hesitate to attack. He took a few steps closer, the bear growling softly, its body trembling from pain. Daniel paused, his senses on high alert, trying to gauge the animal's next move. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. The forest, which had once felt like a familiar sanctuary, now felt vast and unwelcoming. He was alone, with no one around to back him up. Daniel's mind raced. The bear needed help, but was he prepared to risk his life for it? He knew that animals like this were often more dangerous when cornered or in pain. A quick swipe of a bear's paw could disarm him, possibly even take his life. He could feel the weight of his decision pressing on his chest, but then he remembered why he was out here in the first place. His entire life had been dedicated to wildlife conservation, to ensuring that these creatures didn't just survive, they thrived. Daniel wasn't just an observer. He was a protector, a steward of the land. This was his calling. With a deep breath, Daniel pushed aside the fear that gnawed at him. He had been in tight situations before, and his training had always pulled him through. He could do this. He had to. The bear's soft sobs broke through his thoughts, and Daniel made up his mind. He slowly crouched down, speaking in low, soothing tones, trying to calm the bear. His heart raced as he took another careful step closer. The bear's eyes, though wild with pain, seemed to soften, as if sensing that Daniel wasn't a threat. It was a small moment of trust in an ocean of fear, and Daniel knew it was the only opening he'd get. The trap, with its cold steel jaws, gleamed in the sunlight, mocked Daniel from the ground. It had done its damage, but it didn't get to decide the fate of this animal. Not on his watch. Daniel's hands shook as he reached for his tools. His thoughts narrowed to one singular purpose. He would free the bear, no matter the danger. As he knelt beside the bear, the animal growled again. But Daniel saw something in those eyes, something almost pleading. He had to make his move. He steeled himself, his fingers brushing against the bear's bloodied paw. Every part of him screamed to back away, but the bear's pain was louder than any fear he felt. The next moments would be crucial. Daniel knew this was a decision he would never forget. There was no turning back. The bear's growls grew louder, more frantic as Daniel carefully positioned the pry bar. It was a delicate balance. If he made any sudden moves, the bear could lash out. Daniel didn't want to harm it, but he knew he had to act quickly. The bear's paw was already badly injured, and every minute it spent struggling in the trap meant more pain, more blood lost. With a steady hand, Daniel began to work, easing the pry bar into the gap between the trap's jaws. The bear tensed, its body jerking in response to the pressure on its paw, and Daniel held his breath, praying it wouldn't lash out. The bear's growls turned into soft, pained whimpers, and Daniel's heart ached at the sound. He spoke in soft tones, his voice low and calming, trying to reassure the bear that he was there to help, even though he wasn't sure if the animal understood. The trap resisted at first, its steel jaws stubbornly clamped down, but Daniel didn't give up. His muscles burned with the effort, his hands slick with sweat, but he couldn't stop now. The bear's breath came in short, ragged bursts, each one a reminder of the urgency of the situation. Daniel could feel the weight of the animal's suffering pressing on him, but he pushed through, focusing only on the task at hand. As Daniel pried the trap open just enough to give the bear some breathing room, it let out a low, pained roar. It was a sound that sent a chill down Daniel's spine, but he didn't flinch. He kept his focus, his hands steady, working to open the trap further. The bear thrashed again, its body trembling, and for a moment Daniel feared the animal would strike. But he spoke calmly again, his voice a soft lull in the midst of chaos, trying to keep the bear from panicking. The minutes felt like hours as Daniel fought against the stubborn trap, each movement deliberate, each breath measured. The bear's growls had softened, but its body was still rigid with fear and pain. Daniel could see the exhaustion in the animal's eyes, the way its muscles quivered with the strain of the struggle. It wasn't just physical pain, it was the emotional toll as well. The bear was trapped, cornered, and Daniel knew that no matter how much he wanted to ease its suffering, there was only so much he could do. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest as he made one last, desperate push against the trap. His muscles screamed in protest, but he couldn't stop now. He had to free the bear, no matter what. The metal jaws gave way, just enough to create a gap wide enough for the animal to escape. Daniel took a shaky breath, his hands trembling with the effort, as he pulled the trap open, freeing the bear's mangled paw from its grip. The bear let out a soft, relieved grunt, the sound echoing in the silence of the forest. It was free, but Daniel knew the animal wasn't unscathed. Its movements were slow and cautious as it tried to stand, its paw dragging slightly as it tested its weight. It was a painful sight. The bear was injured, its fur matted with blood, but at least it wasn't trapped anymore. That was something. Daniel stepped back, his breath still coming in short bursts as the bear staggered away from him. The animal's steps were uneven, the weight of its injury clearly affecting it, but it was moving. Daniel watched, not daring to make a sound, his eyes fixed on the bear. Every muscle in his body tensed, unsure of what would happen next. Would the bear attack him? Would it flee into the forest, its pain too great to bear? Daniel couldn't predict what the bear would do now, It had been through too much. But to his surprise, the bear didn't charge at him, nor did it flee. It limped away, its massive form weaving through the trees, its movements heavy and labored. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as the bear paused just a few feet away, its head turning back to face him. For a moment they were locked in a silent exchange. Man and beast, two creatures caught in a moment that neither had expected. The bear didn't snarl, didn't growl, but simply looked at Daniel, its dark eyes full of something Daniel couldn't quite define. Was it gratitude or simply acknowledgement of the help he had given? The moment stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity, and Daniel felt a strange calm wash over him. The bear had survived the trap, and now it was standing on its own 2 feet, though still hurting, still vulnerable. But it was free. Daniel had given it that freedom. The bear's gaze lingered for just a moment longer before it turned away and continued its slow, painful trek toward the clearing. Daniel remained motionless, his eyes never leaving the animal as it vanished into the distance. He didn't know if the bear would make it, if it would survive the injury or the harsh conditions of the wild, but for now it had its chance. That was all he could offer. As the last of the bear's massive form disappeared from view, Daniel felt a sense of quiet satisfaction settle over him. The world around him seemed to hold its breath, as though nature itself recognized the delicate balance that had just been restored. The forest, with its quiet hum of life, seemed to breathe easier now, and Daniel found himself slowly exhaling, his chest finally loosening from the tight grip of tension. The sun had started to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. Daniel sat on a moss-covered rock near the edge, his legs tucked beneath him. The weight of the day settled on his shoulders, a heaviness that didn't come from fatigue, but from something deeper, something more profound. His gaze wandered aimlessly through the trees, but his mind was far from the forest. It was with the bear who had shown him a part of the wild. He couldn't quite explain. The air was still, the usual rustling of leaves and distant calls of birds muted, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The silence was peaceful, yet it was also laden with the unspoken. The bear was free now, but its journey was far from over. Daniel could still see its struggle, each step a battle against the injury, the hunger, the unrelenting conditions of the forest. It would need time to heal, maybe even longer than Daniel had hoped. He had given the bear a chance, but nature had its own rules, ones that no amount of kindness or compassion could alter. Daniel thought about all the years he had spent in the forest, working with wildlife, often in the background of human concerns, quietly tending to the animals that suffered without anyone noticing. For all the advancements and technologies in the world, people still couldn't see the pain in the eyes of a wounded animal or understand the strain of the wild, where survival was a constant struggle. He had watched countless creatures endure things no being should have to. Traps, injuries, loss of habitat, the creeping threat of human encroachment. It was a harsh world, and too often Daniel had been reminded that for all his efforts there were far more animals suffering than could ever be helped. He thought back to the bear, to the way its eyes had locked with his. There was a moment, just before it limped away, when it seemed as if the animal had known. Daniel could never be sure, but in that fleeting exchange he had felt something pass between them, a connection, however brief, that transcended the usual observer and subject relationship. It was as if the bear understood that Daniel wasn't a threat, that he was offering something rare, an opportunity, but it was also an unspoken goodbye. Daniel would never know if the bear would return to the clearing, if it would survive, or if it would remember him at all. He shifted slightly, watching the sunlight filter through the trees in a soft golden haze. In the distance, a deer stepped cautiously into the clearing, its ears twitching as it scanned for danger. Daniel's hand instinctively reached for his binoculars, but he hesitated. He wasn't here to observe anymore. Today had been different. He had done something for the bear, something that felt right. He didn't need to watch it from afar anymore. The deer, too, had its own path to follow. Daniel respected that. The moments passed quietly, the soft sounds of the forest returning as the deer moved on. Daniel found himself contemplating his place in all of this. He had spent his life among animals, But he realized something in that moment. Perhaps it wasn't just about saving them, it was about allowing them to live on their terms, to recover in their own time. He had given the bear its chance, but ultimately it was up to the bear to decide whether it would take it. The forest had begun to cool, the shadows growing longer as the sun dipped further behind the canopy. Daniel trudged along the faint trail back to his camp, the quiet hum of nature filling his ears. His boots crunched softly against the forest floor, a rhythm that normally soothed him. But tonight felt different. There was an unease he couldn't shake, an undercurrent that threaded itself into the stillness. As he walked, a faint rustling behind him broke the quiet. Daniel froze, his instincts sharpening. The sound was faint but deliberate, like something or someone was there, moving with careful intent. Slowly he turned, his eyes scanning the dense forest. Shadows stretched between the trees, branches swayed gently in the evening breeze, and yet nothing seemed out of place. He lingered, his gaze sweeping over every branch and patch of undergrowth, half expecting to see the bear emerge. But there was nothing, just the endless sprawl of the forest. Daniel's heart beat faster as the sense of being watched clung to him, a prickling at the back of his neck that refused to go away. He tried to dismiss it as his imagination, the residual tension of the day playing tricks on him. But even as he turned back toward camp, his footsteps quickening slightly, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, hidden and waiting. The next few days passed uneventfully, though the memory of the rustling haunted Daniel. He returned to his usual work, tracking wildlife, setting up cameras, and monitoring the health of the forest's ecosystem. His days were long and filled with activity, but that sense of unease lingered. Every so often, as he moved through the woods, he felt it again, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. It wasn't constant, but it was there, subtle and unnerving. On the fifth day, Daniel decided to return to the area near the clearing where he had encountered the bear. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was a need to reassure himself that the animal was still alive. The forest was quiet as he made his way through, the air heavy with the earthy scent of damp leaves and soil. As he approached the clearing, something caught his attention. It was a disturbance in the foliage, a subtle movement that didn't match the rhythm of the wind. Daniel stopped, crouching low and peering through the undergrowth. And then he saw it, the bear. It was farther ahead, moving cautiously through the trees. Its injured leg was still stiff, but it seemed to have gained some strength. Daniel felt a strange mixture of relief and concern. The bear had survived so far, but it was still vulnerable, and the forest was unforgiving. He watched it for a moment, his breath steadying as he observed its movements. But then he noticed something odd. The bear wasn't just wandering, it was following him. Daniel blinked, unsure at first if he was imagining things. He moved a few steps forward, and the bear mirrored him, maintaining its distance but keeping him in its line of sight. It wasn't aggressive, and it didn't seem to be stalking him in the predatory sense. It was almost curious. The realization sent a chill through Daniel. He had spent years working with wildlife, and he knew how rare it was for an animal, especially one as solitary as a bear, to behave this way. There was no logical reason for it to be following him. Animals didn't hold on to encounters the way humans did. They lived moment to moment, driven by instinct. And yet here it was, watching him with an intent that Daniel couldn't quite decipher. Daniel continued walking, his pace slower now, his senses heightened. The bear followed at a safe distance, always keeping him in view but never approaching. It was as if it was waiting for something, though Daniel couldn't imagine what. By the time he reached his camp, the bear had disappeared into the shadows. Daniel scanned the tree line one last time before stepping inside his small cabin. The feeling of being watched had not left him, and now it was accompanied by a gnawing sense of unease. Why was the bear following him? Was it merely a coincidence, or was there something else at play? That night, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his cabin. The forest outside was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, but his thoughts were consumed by the bear. He couldn't shake the image of its eyes, the way they seemed to hold some kind of understanding, some kind of purpose. Days passed, and Daniel began to notice the bear more often. It never approached him directly, but its presence was undeniable. Sometimes he would catch a glimpse of its shadow moving between the trees or hear the faint crack of a branch behind him. Other times he would feel the weight of its gaze steady and unrelenting, as if it was studying him just as carefully as he was studying it. At first, Daniel found the bear's behavior unnerving, but as the days turned into weeks, unease gave way to something else: curiosity. He started to wonder if the bear remembered him from that first encounter, if it recognized him as the one who had given it a chance to survive. The thought filled him with a strange sense of responsibility, as though he was now tethered to this animal in a way he couldn't fully explain. One morning, as Daniel ventured deeper into the forest to check on one of his wildlife cameras, he felt it again, that sense of being watched. He turned and there it was, standing just a few yards away. The bear was larger than he remembered, its thick fur catching the dappled sunlight that filtered through the canopy. Its injured legs seemed stronger now, though it still moved with a slight limp. For a moment they simply stood there, the world around them fading into silence. Daniel's pulse quickened as he realized how close they were, how little separated them. The bear made no move to charge or retreat. It just watched him, its dark eyes calm but piercing, as though it was waiting for something. Daniel's mind raced. This was a dangerous situation, one that could turn deadly in an instant. Yet as he looked into the bear's eyes, he felt none of the fear he expected. Instead, there was a quiet understanding, an unspoken agreement that neither of them would harm the other. Slowly, Daniel lowered himself to the ground, kneeling in the soft dirt. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, never breaking eye contact with the bear. He extended a hand, not to touch, but as a gesture of peace, of trust. The bear didn't move, but its eyes softened, the tension in its massive frame easing just slightly. The moment stretched on, fragile and timeless. Daniel felt a surge of something he couldn't quite name: respect, awe, maybe even gratitude. This was more than an encounter with wildlife. It was a connection, raw and profound, that seemed to bridge the divide between their worlds. As the bear finally turned and lumbered away, Daniel remained kneeling, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this wasn't just chance. The bear had chosen to approach him, to acknowledge him in a way that defied everything he knew about animal behavior. In the days that followed, the bond between them grew. The bear continued to follow Daniel from a distance, always keeping him in sight, but never intruding. Daniel began to see it as a silent guardian, a companion in the solitude of the forest. He found himself talking to it sometimes, even though he knew it couldn't be understood. It was comforting in a way, to have someone, something there, sharing the vastness of the wild. One afternoon, as Daniel was setting up a new camera near a stream, he looked up to see the bear standing on the opposite bank. It watched him quietly, its presence no longer startling, but almost reassuring. Daniel paused, lowering his tools as he met its gaze. He didn't know what the bear wanted or why it continued to stay near him, but he felt no need to question it. The forest seemed different now, as though it too recognized the bond that had formed between them. Daniel felt a sense of belonging he hadn't experienced in years, a connection not just to the bear, but to the wild as a whole. He realized that he had spent so much of his life trying to protect nature, to save it, without truly understanding what it meant to be a part of it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in hues of gold and crimson, Daniel stood by the stream, watching the bear disappear into the shadows. He knew this connection wouldn't last forever. The bear would move on, as it should, and so would he. But for now, in this fleeting moment, they were bound by something greater than fear or survival. It was a bond unspoken, yet unbreakable, a reminder of the delicate threads that tied all life together. And in that realization, Daniel found a sense of peace he hadn't known he was searching for. The forest had an energy of its own, a rhythm Daniel had come to feel rather than hear. Every rustle of leaves, every bird call, and the distant rush of the stream seemed to weave a symphony he hadn't noticed before. Yet beneath this harmony lay a growing unease, a subtle disruption that felt out of place. The serene wilderness that once embraced him now seemed to whisper warnings. One afternoon, while wandering deeper into the woods, Daniel stumbled upon a sight that froze him. A crude metal trap glinted in the dappled sunlight, its sharp teeth waiting to snap shut. It was one of several traps scattered across the area, each hidden with sinister precision. His stomach churned at the thought of the bear, his newfound companion, wandering into this treachery. These traps weren't just tools. They were weapons designed to destroy. Daniel crouched by the nearest trap, studying its brutal mechanism. It was freshly laid, suggesting the poachers weren't far. He couldn't let this stand. The bear, the forest, and its creatures deserved more than this senseless violence. The bond he had formed with the wild compelled him to act, even as fear gnawed at the edges of his resolve. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Daniel moved through the forest, dismantling traps with care. Each snap of the metal jaws echoed through the trees, a sound both satisfying and nerve-wracking. He was acutely aware of his vulnerability. The poachers could return at any moment. The crunch of footsteps on dry leaves startled him. Daniel's heart pounded as he ducked behind a tree. Peering out cautiously, he saw 3 men moving through the underbrush. Their rifles gleamed, slung casually over their shoulders, but their eyes were sharp, scanning the forest for movement. They were talking, their voices low and tense, but Daniel couldn't make out the words. Suddenly the wind shifted, carrying a scent familiar yet unexpected. The bear. Daniel's chest tightened. The men were heading straight toward the area the bear often roamed. He had to do something, but the weight of their rifles made his options limited. He couldn't risk confronting them directly, not yet. Daniel moved stealthily, staying just out of their sight. The poachers stopped near a clearing, inspecting a set of traps they had laid earlier. One of them laughed, a harsh sound that grated against the natural harmony of the forest. Daniel's fist clenched. Every fiber of his being urged him to act, but his mind screamed for caution. Then the silence of the forest shattered. A deep, guttural growl echoed through the trees. Daniel's blood ran cold as the bear emerged from the shadows, its massive form a silhouette against the fading light. The poachers froze, their bravado evaporating in an instant. The bear charged, a thunderous force of nature, and the men scattered in panic. One dropped his rifle in his haste to flee, the weapon clattering uselessly to the ground. The forest seemed to come alive at that moment, every sound amplified, the snapping of branches, the pounding of boots, and the bear's ferocious roars. Daniel watched in awe as the bear stopped short of pursuing the men further. It turned its head, its dark eyes meeting Daniel's. In that moment, Daniel understood. This wasn't just the bear defending its territory, it was protecting him. As the poacher's footsteps faded into the distance, the bear approached Daniel, its movements calm but purposeful. The space between them felt charged with unspoken understanding. Daniel extended a hand, not to touch, but as a gesture of gratitude. The bear paused, then turned and disappeared into the shadows once more. In the days that followed, the forest seemed to reclaim its peace. Daniel continued to patrol the area, removing the remaining traps and ensuring the poachers hadn't returned. Yet he couldn't shake the memory of the bear's actions. How could an animal, driven by instinct and survival, display such loyalty? It was a question that lingered, one he might never fully answer. The bear, as if sensing Daniel's thoughts, began appearing more frequently. Sometimes it watched from a distance, a silent sentinel. Other times it came closer, its presence a quiet reassurance. Daniel noticed how the bear would pause near areas where danger might lurk, as if scouting ahead for him. Each encounter deepened Daniel's connection to the wild. He saw the forest not just as a collection of trees and animals, but as a living, breathing entity. The bear was a part of that life, and so he realized, was he? Daniel found himself venturing deeper into the forest each day, carrying supplies in his worn backpack. His goal was simple: help the bear recover, both physically and emotionally. Though the bear's wounds had long since healed, Daniel could see the subtle signs of wear in its movements, fatigue in its gait, and occasional hesitation as it climbed over fallen trees. Daniel began leaving small offerings: fish, berries, and even honey from a nearby beekeeper he knew well. The bear would accept the food cautiously at first, always maintaining its distance. Over time, however, it seemed to recognize Daniel's gestures as acts of kindness. The encounters became more frequent. The bear would appear as Daniel was setting out supplies or working to repair areas of the forest damaged by the poachers. Sometimes it stood at the edge of the clearing, its dark eyes observing him with quiet curiosity. Other times it would come close enough for Daniel to feel the weight of its presence. There was no aggression, no fear, just an unspoken understanding. Daniel felt a strange calm settle over him during these moments. He had spent years patrolling the forest, seeing it as his duty to protect the land. But now with the bear, it felt different. The forest wasn't just a responsibility, it was a home. And the bear wasn't just another creature, it was a companion, bound to him in a way he couldn't fully explain. But peace in the forest never lasted long. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel smelled smoke. The scent was faint at first, carried by a gentle breeze. He scanned the treetops, his heart sinking as he spotted a plume of gray rising in the distance. A fire. It was the worst fear of any ranger, especially in a forest as vast and untamed as this one. Daniel wasted no time. He grabbed his emergency gear from the station and radioed for backup. The fire wasn't just a threat to the trees and wildlife. It was a potential death trap for anything unable to escape its path. As Daniel made his way toward the source of the smoke, his thoughts turned to the bear. The flames had already begun to spread, consuming dry underbrush and leaping from one tree to the next. The crackling roar of the fire filled the air, drowning out the sounds of the forest. Daniel's eyes stung from the smoke as he called out, his voice hoarse, scanning the chaos for any sign of the bear. Finally, he spotted it. A dark shape moving through the haze, its massive form barely visible through the thick smoke. The bear was struggling, its movements sluggish and disoriented. Daniel's heart pounded as he realized it was heading in the wrong direction, toward the densest part of the fire. Daniel shouted again, waving his arms to get the bear's attention. He doubted it could hear him over the roar of the flames, but the bear stopped, turning its head toward him. For a moment, their eyes met, and Daniel saw a flicker of recognition. He pushed through the underbrush, ignoring the searing heat that bit at his skin. The bear hesitated, its instincts battling the trust it had slowly built in Daniel. Finally, it took a step toward him, then another. Daniel led the way, navigating around fallen trees and smoldering patches of ground. The smoke grew thicker, and Daniel's vision blurred. He could feel the heat pressing against him, each breath a struggle. He glanced back to see the bear faltering, its massive frame swaying. Daniel's heart ached at the sight. It was a creature of incredible strength, yet here it was, vulnerable and trusting him to lead the way. He reached into his pack, pulling out a soaked cloth he'd brought for emergencies. Pressing it over his mouth and nose, he moved back toward the bear, guiding it with calm, deliberate motions. It followed, its steps unsteady but determined. The escape was harrowing. Flames licked at the edges of their path, and the ground beneath them threatened to give way to smoldering embers. Daniel felt his strength waning, but he refused to stop. The bear needed him, and he wasn't going to let it down. Finally, after what felt like hours, they broke through the wall of smoke into a clearing untouched by the fire. Daniel collapsed onto the grass, gasping for air. The bear stood nearby, its sides heaving as it tried to recover. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the silence broken only by the distant crackle of the fire and the faint rustle of leaves. As the night wore on, the fire was contained by the efforts of Daniel's team. He returned to the clearing, bringing water and food for the bear. It approached him cautiously, its dark eyes meeting his once more. There was something different this time, a quiet gratitude, a bond forged not just in moments of peace, but in the heart of danger. The days that followed were marked by a strange sense of renewal. The forest bore scars from the fire, but life persisted. New shoots of green began to emerge from the ashes, a testament to nature's resilience. Daniel saw the bear less frequently now, but when it appeared, it was with a quiet confidence. It no longer watched him from a distance, but stood closer, its presence a reminder of their shared journey. Daniel knew the bond they shared was rare, something few could understand. The forest had always been his responsibility, but now it was more than that. It was a part of him, as was the bear. Together they had faced the fire and emerged stronger. And though the forest would take time to heal, Daniel felt certain of one thing: he and the bear would always be a part of its story. Weeks passed, and the forest slowly regained its rhythm. The once charred land began to show signs of life, with small shoots of green sprouting from the ashen soil. Daniel spent his days repairing damaged trails and monitoring wildlife, ensuring the ecosystem had a chance to heal. But amid all his work, his thoughts often drifted to the bear. Their bond, forged in moments of both tranquility and peril, had left an indelible mark on him. The bear continued to visit him, though its appearances became less frequent. When it did appear, it stood closer than ever before, almost as if to reassure Daniel that it was doing well. Then one crisp morning, Daniel noticed something unusual. The bear wasn't following its usual path through the clearing. Instead, it was moving deeper into the forest, venturing into areas Daniel rarely explored. He stood at a distance, watching the bear's deliberate steps. It didn't glance back, its powerful frame cutting through the underbrush with quiet determination. Daniel felt a pang of bittersweet realization. The bear was ready to return to the wild on its own terms. He didn't call out or try to stop it. This was how it should be, how it had to be. The forest was vast and the bear belonged to it, not to him. Over the next few days, Daniel found himself scanning the horizon, hoping for a glimpse of his old companion. But the bear didn't return. The clearing felt emptier without its presence, yet Daniel couldn't bring himself to feel sorrow. Instead, he felt a profound sense of closure, knowing that their time together had been meaningful, both for him and the bear. As the weeks turned into months, Daniel threw himself into his conservation work with renewed purpose. The fire had brought the fragility of the forest into sharp focus, and he was determined to protect it from future harm. He began working closely with local communities, educating them about the importance of preserving wildlife habitats and the dangers of illegal trapping. The story of the bear became a cornerstone of his advocacy. Though he never mentioned the details of their bond, he spoke passionately about the intelligence and resilience of wildlife, using the bear as an example of the strength and beauty found in nature. He shared stories of its bravery during the fire and its eventual return to the wild, hoping to inspire others to see animals not as threats or resources, but as partners in the ecosystem. One day, as Daniel was preparing for a community workshop, he noticed a framed photograph on his desk. It was an image of the clearing, taken long before the fire, when the forest was at its most vibrant. In the corner of the photo, almost hidden among the shadows, was the unmistakable outline of the bear. Daniel hadn't noticed it when the picture was first taken, but now it felt like a small, quiet reminder of everything they had shared. The memory of the bear stayed with Daniel, shaping his approach to his work and his life. He began collaborating with other rangers and wildlife experts, pushing for stricter regulations against poaching and advocating for humane methods of wildlife management. His efforts didn't go unnoticed, and soon he was invited to speak at conservation conferences, sharing his experiences and the lessons he had learned. Despite his growing recognition, Daniel remained grounded. The forest was still his priority, and he continued his patrols with the same dedication as before. On one such patrol, he stumbled upon a set of tracks, large, familiar, and unmistakably those of a bear. His heart leapt, but he knew better than to hope for a reunion. The tracks led deeper into the forest, disappearing among the trees. Daniel smiled to himself, feeling a sense of reassurance. The bear was still out there, thriving in the wild where it belonged. Their paths might never cross again, but that was the way of the forest. Unpredictable, untamed, and endlessly beautiful. As Daniel walked back to his station, he felt a quiet contentment. The forest had given him more than he could ever repay. It had taught him about resilience, trust, and the profound connections that could form between humans and animals. And though his bond with the bear had come to an end, it was a chapter of his life he would always carry with him. Years rolled by, but Daniel's commitment to the forest never wavered. His work had taken him to new places, but his heart remained tethered to the vast expanse of trees, rivers, and wildlife that had shaped his life. Stories of his bond with the bear, though never explicitly told, had become a quiet legend among those who worked in conservation. Daniel had become a respected voice in his field, yet he still found solace in the solitude of the forest. One late afternoon, while reviewing data on a wildlife preservation project, Daniel's phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to a colleague from the local ranger unit. Their tone was urgent, laden with worry. Reports of illegal poaching had surfaced, this time in the area where Daniel had once encountered the bear. The thought of poachers encroaching on such sacred ground filled Daniel with a sense of urgency he hadn't felt in years. Daniel gathered his gear and set out immediately, his mind racing with questions. What kind of operation was taking place? Were the animals he had protected at risk? And, though he didn't want to admit it, one thought lingered above the rest. Was the bear still alive? When he arrived at the outskirts of the forest, Daniel met with the rangers who had reported the activity. They shared grim details. Traps had been discovered, and signs of large animals being hunted were evident. The poachers were skilled, using the dense terrain to their advantage and avoiding detection for weeks. Daniel's intimate knowledge of the forest gave him an edge. He knew the terrain like the back of his hand and could anticipate the paths the poachers might use. Setting off before dawn, he began to track their movements, noting broken branches and faint boot prints. Every step he took was measured, his senses heightened by the tension of the hunt. As he ventured deeper into the forest, the memories of his time with the bear came flooding back. The clearing where they had first met, the fire that had brought them together, the silent companionship they had shared. Each memory fueled his determination to protect this land and the creatures within it. It was on the third day of his patrols that Daniel saw something that stopped him in his tracks. Large paw prints in the soil. They were fresh, unmistakable, and heading in the same direction as the poacher's trail. Daniel's heart raced. Could it be the same bear? Following the tracks, Daniel came upon a scene that left him breathless. In a small clearing, the bear stood, its massive form unmistakable even after all these years. It was older now, its fur dusted with gray, but its presence was as commanding as ever. The bear seemed to sense Daniel's approach and turned to face him. Their eyes met, and in that moment the years melted away. Daniel barely had time to process the reunion before movement in the distance caught his eye. The poachers were nearby, their voices faint but growing louder. He ducked behind a tree, his mind racing. He had no backup and no time to call for reinforcements. It was just him and the bear. The bear, as if understanding the danger, moved toward Daniel. Its eyes scanned the forest, ears twitching at the sound of the intruders. Daniel felt a surge of adrenaline. Together they had faced danger before. Now they would do it again. As the poachers entered the clearing, Daniel used his knowledge of the forest to his advantage. He signaled to the bear, guiding it toward a hidden path that would flank the poachers. The bear moved with surprising stealth, its massive frame blending into the shadows. The tension in the forest was palpable. Daniel crouched behind the tree, his breath measured as he assessed the situation. The poachers were now fully visible, armed and scanning the area with sharp eyes. They carried traps, ropes, and rifles, tools of destruction meant to capture and harm the very life Daniel had sworn to protect. He glanced at the bear, which waited just beyond the clearing, its powerful body coiled with alertness. The unspoken understanding between them was clear. They had to act swiftly and decisively. Daniel had spent years mastering the forest's intricacies, and now that knowledge was his greatest weapon. He picked up a small stone and hurled it toward the poacher's right flank, creating a sharp rustle in the underbrush. The men spun toward the sound, rifles raised, their voices low but frantic. It was the distraction Daniel needed. He motioned to the bear, which slipped silently into the shadows, circling to the other side of the clearing. The poachers advanced toward the sound, their focus diverted. Daniel seized the opportunity to move, positioning himself behind a fallen tree just a few feet away from them. He could feel his pulse in his ears as he reached for the radio clipped to his belt. Static crackled faintly as he transmitted the coordinates to his team. Help was on the way, but he and the bear would need to hold the poachers off until then. From the other side of the clearing, the bear made its presence known. It stepped out from the shadows, its massive form illuminated by a shaft of sunlight filtering through the canopy. The poachers froze, their bravado evaporating in the face of the imposing creature. One of them raised his rifle, but the bear let out a thunderous roar, the sound reverberating through the forest like a shockwave. The men stumbled back, their confidence shaken. Daniel took advantage of their hesitation. He emerged from his hiding spot, yelling to draw their attention away from the bear. The men turned toward him, momentarily unsure of where to direct their focus. The bear, moving with surprising speed, circled behind them, cutting off their escape route. The poachers were now trapped between Daniel and the bear. One of them tried to flee, but the bear lunged forward, its sheer size and power forcing the man to drop his rifle in fear. Another poacher reached for a trap, but Daniel intervened, grabbing a sturdy branch and knocking the trap out of his hands. The standoff intensified as the remaining poachers realized they were outmatched. Their weapons were useless against the coordinated efforts of man and beast. Daniel could see the fear in their eyes as they backed away, their confidence reduced to desperation. Finally, the sound of approaching footsteps and voices signaled the arrival of Daniel's team. The poachers, now surrounded, had no choice but to surrender. They were disarmed and restrained as the authorities moved in to secure the area. As the chaos subsided, Daniel turned to the bear, which stood a short distance away, watching him. Its breathing was heavy, its muscles tense, but its eyes held the same calm intelligence that Daniel had come to recognize. The moment felt surreal, as if time had slowed to acknowledge the gravity of what had just occurred. When the poachers were escorted out of the forest, Daniel took a moment to survey the clearing. The traps and weapons left behind were a sobering reminder of the danger the forest faced. Yet as he looked at the bear resting near the edge of the clearing, he felt an overwhelming sense of triumph. Together, they had protected the forest once again. Daniel sat on a fallen log, his body weary, but his spirit invigorated. The bear, its breathing now steady, settled a few feet away. The forest around them was silent, the usual chorus of birds and insects subdued, as if in reverence for what had transpired. In the quiet moments that followed, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. His encounter with the bear had been unexpected, but it had transformed him in ways he couldn't have imagined. The bear had shown him the power of trust, the resilience of nature, and the unbreakable connection between humans and the wild. He thought about how this bond had shaped his career. He had entered the field of conservation to protect wildlife, but the bear had taught him the deeper meaning of his work. It wasn't just about preserving the forest, it was about understanding it, becoming a part of it, and fighting for its survival with unwavering determination. The bear stirred, its massive head turning toward Daniel one last time. There was no need for words or gestures. The understanding between them was complete. The bear rose to its feet, its movements slow but deliberate, and began to make its way back into the forest. Daniel watched as it disappeared among the trees, its silhouette fading into the dappled light. Though the bear was gone, Daniel knew it would always be a part of him. Their bond had left an indelible mark on his soul, a reminder of the extraordinary connections that could form between man and nature. As he stood and began to make his way back to the ranger station, he felt a deep sense of peace. The forest was quiet once more, but its story and his place within it would continue. Daniel knew that his work was far from over. The threats to the wilderness would persist, but so would his resolve. And somewhere, deep within the forest, the bear would roam free, a living testament to their shared fight for survival. The morning sun filtered through the trees as Daniel sat at his desk in the ranger station, reviewing reports of recent activity in the forest. The quiet was interrupted by the crackle of his radio, the dispatcher's urgent voice calling out a new situation. A young deer had been spotted caught in a trap near the northern edge of the forest. Without hesitation, Daniel grabbed his gear and headed out. The location was deep within the woods, a familiar part of the forest that Daniel had patrolled countless times. As he approached the area, his heart sank at the sight before him. The deer, small and trembling, was ensnared by a metal trap around its hind leg. Its wide, fearful eyes darted toward Daniel as he knelt to assess the situation. Years of experience allowed Daniel to move calmly and efficiently. He spoke softly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The deer flinched as he reached for the trap, but Daniel persisted, his hands steady despite the urgency of the moment. The mechanism was rusted and stubborn, but after several tense minutes, it gave way. The deer bolted a few steps before turning to look at Daniel one last time, as if acknowledging his help, before disappearing into the trees. As he packed up the discarded trap, Daniel felt a wave of emotions. The rescue was a stark reminder of the ongoing threats the forest faced. It also reignited a fire within him, a deep-seated passion for wildlife conservation that had only grown stronger over the years. Back at the station, Daniel contacted a group of conservationists he had met at a recent wildlife summit. These individuals shared his vision of a forest free from poaching and exploitation. Over the next few weeks, they formed a coalition, pooling their resources and expertise to create a series of initiatives aimed at protecting the wild. The group's plans included installing surveillance systems to deter poachers, running educational programs to raise awareness about the importance of wildlife, and advocating for stricter laws against illegal hunting. Daniel, with his decades of experience, became a natural leader in these efforts. His stories, particularly the one about the bear, became a cornerstone of their message. As the months passed, their work began to make a tangible difference. The forest saw fewer traps, and the number of poaching incidents decreased. Local communities, inspired by Daniel's dedication, started participating in conservation activities, planting trees, and reporting suspicious activity. Daniel's bond with the bear, once a deeply personal story, had grown into a symbol of hope and resilience, inspiring people far beyond the forest borders. Years turned into decades, and Daniel, now an older man, found himself reflecting on the incredible journey his life had taken. Sitting on the porch of his modest cabin at the edge of the forest, he watched the trees sway in the breeze, their leaves catching the golden light of sunset. The bear's memory lingered in his mind as vivid as the day they had parted. He realized that the bond he had shared with the bear was more than a momentary connection. It had been the catalyst for everything that followed, a life devoted to protecting the wilderness and inspiring others to do the same. The bear had taught him the value of trust, the importance of coexistence, and the power of perseverance. Daniel's work was now celebrated globally. Documentaries, books, and lectures shared his story, reaching people from all walks of life. The bear's tale, in particular, captured hearts, changing perspectives on the treatment of animals in the wild. It became a rallying cry for conservationists, a reminder of the profound connections that could exist between humans and nature. One evening, as Daniel sat by the fire, he thought about the young deer he had rescued, the conservationists he had worked with, and the countless lives, human and animal, that had been touched by his efforts. The forest outside his window was alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves, a testament to the life he had fought so hard to protect. Though his steps were slower now and his hair had turned gray, Daniel felt no regret. He had lived a life of purpose, shaped by a single extraordinary bond. And as the night deepened and the stars illuminated the sky, he knew that the bear's story, and his own, would continue to inspire generations to come. Daniel's story with the bear isn't just a touching tale of compassion and resilience. It's a powerful reminder that even the smallest actions can spark monumental change. From that heart-stopping moment when Daniel risked his life to free the bear, to the decades he spent safeguarding the forest, it all proves that humans and nature can coexist in respect and harmony. His legacy lives on not just in the wilderness he protected, but in the hearts of everyone inspired by his journey. If this incredible bond between man and nature has moved you, stick with us to uncover more amazing stories like this one. Please hit that subscribe button on our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Together, let's spread the message of protecting our natural world and keep writing new chapters in this extraordinary adventure. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next video.